I'm sure if you're watching this, you already know about the protest in Los Angeles. And if you don't know about the protests in Los Angeles, well, there are protests in Los Angeles. The proximate cause of those protests are a crackdown by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, a crackdown driven by the fact that the White House, the Trump administration, cannot meet its stated deportation numbers. During the campaign, President Trump promised to deport millions of undocumented immigrants, and the slight trouble is that there aren't actually that many easily deportable undocumented immigrants. There's no database of undocumented immigrants. You have to actually find them. The president also promised to deport all of the millions of criminal undocumented immigrants, people breaking laws. And the fact about that is that that population doesn't really exist, other than perhaps illegally crossing a border, which is a crime. Most people who are undocumented have committed no more than a civil offense in overstaying a visa or not having the proper papers, not having legal status. And if they are living and working here, they're likely not engaged in any criminal activity, any violence or theft or anything like that. In fact, immigrants of all classes are dramatically less likely to be engaged in criminal behavior than native-born citizens for reasons that should be obvious. First, you're motivated to be in a different country to work and make a living for yourself. And second, attracting the attention of law enforcement is detrimental to your prospects for staying in that country. What this has meant for the administration is that the promise of an easy deportation plan is not feasible. It's not possible. They're not going to be able to do it. And so last month, according to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, Stephen Miller, the president's top aide and one of the architects of his immigration agenda, went to Immigration and Customs Enforcement with essentially an ultimatum. You have to deport more people. You should stop focusing so much on criminals. You should start going to places where people who are here to work gather, Home Depots, 7-Elevens, and you should round up people there. That's what you should do. And that's what ICE did. And last Friday, they began a large such operation in Los Angeles, where they targeted a Home Depot in a predominantly Latino neighborhood of the city. One interesting aspect of immigration politics right now is that when you ask Americans, do you want mass deportations? They tend to say yes. A majority tends to say yes. There's a recent CBS News poll that finds this exact thing. But then when you ask them, do you approve of how the Trump administration is going about mass deportations? They say no. When you ask them, do you think people should have due process? They say yes. If you ask them whether they think people who are just laborers or people who have made homes, started businesses, if they should be deported, they say no. And what's happening here actually makes total sense. Americans are convinced of the idea that there is a large number of criminal undocumented immigrants. Again, this is false. And they are supportive of the idea that the government would deport these people. But because this population doesn't really exist, the people who are being deported are ordinary, hardworking individuals who just happen to be undocumented. And Americans don't like that. And you're seeing this play out literally in Los Angeles. Because when ICE shows up to start snatching people looking for work and throwing them in the trucks and deporting them, maybe sending them to that awful prison in El Salvador, ordinary Americans, citizens, stood up and said no. Began blocking ICE, began using their bodies to prevent this from happening. And a protest came out of it. First a few thousand people, now 10,000 or more people protesting every day against this deportation effort. And it's spawning protests in other cities. As you know, I'm sure, the president has responded to these protests by mobilizing the National Guard and sending Marines in. I'll say here that there's a whole separate video to do about the illegality of the president's actions with calling out the National Guard and the Marines. So we'll cover that at a later date. We will cover that at a later date. Part of the president's justification for calling out the National Guard and the military is chaos, disorder, anarchy, rioting. And the justification for using those terms is the fact that some cars have been burned, Waymo self-driving cars, and there's been instances of some property damage and people throwing bricks and bottles at police cars. To be perfectly frank, this is relatively tame in the history of civil unrest that happens in American protests, but it is enough of a pretext for the administration to say that it constitutes an assault on the federal government, that it constitutes some sort of insurrection, that in the words of Stephen Miller, it's Los Angeles and California trying to nullify an election and subvert the authority of the United States. Hence, the military. And among political commentators, people like me, although not me, just people in my business, among political commentators, you have those who are saying that this is going to help Trump. That these protests, these images of cars burning, are going to help Trump. That this is what Trump wants, this is the battle he wants to fight, and it's going to assist him in his efforts to consolidate some sort of authoritarian regime. Now here is, I think, the thing about that claim. I think that claim is taking something that is true, which is violence at protests can be harmful to the cause of the protesters, but generalizing it to something that isn't true, which is that protest helps Trump. The first point, it should be said, is much more nuanced than people give it credit for. According to the scholar Omar Rassau, who has studied this for 20 years, I hope I'm saying his last name correctly, the relationship between violence and protest is complicated because protest is most effective when it sends a message, when it captures the attention of the broad public. And it's most able to capture the attention of the broad public when nonviolent protest is met with a violent response from the state. That engenders sympathy for the protesters, engenders sympathy for the message, and is beneficial to the protesters. When the state meets nonviolent protest with no violence of its own, it's much more difficult to get the public's attention, much more difficult to send a message. When there are protesters being violent, vis-a-vis the state, then that also captures attention, but it may redirect the message away from the unjust actions of the state towards the violence of the protesters. But even then, it is capturing attention, and it's having some sort of effect on public opinion. It's not a uniformly bad effect. It can be bad, it can be negative. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, sometimes it's mixed. It's not so simple. And this understanding of the nuances of the impact of violence on protests should carry over into how we understand the protests against Trump. Because here is the thing. A consistent finding in studies of protests and even civil unrest in Donald Trump is that they have been bad for him. Contra some observers and some pundits, the protests against Trump have not been politically beneficial for Trump. Now, from my perspective, this should seem obvious. We all lived through the past 10 years. I assume most of us did. If you are on the younger side and you're watching this, you probably don't quite remember everything that transpired. But I'm in my 30s. I remember. I was covering it. It was part of my job. And one thing I distinctly remember is that protest against Trump in 2017 harmed Trump. The initial wave of protests at airports in response to his attempted Muslim ban impeded his ability to do the Muslim ban and turn public opinion against him. Protests against child separation impeded his ability to do these draconian immigration methods and turn public opinion against him. And this is what the research bears out. With the Muslim ban, for example, protests against the Muslim ban, as well as the initial Women's March at the start of Trump's first term, resulted in a measurable decline in support for banning Muslims from entering the United States. In fact, all kinds of civil unrest that occurred during that first term ended up hurting him, even when the unrest was kind of in his favor. The Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville, from where I am recording this, was a net negative for Trump. People generally just don't like protest and disorder, and they blame the incumbent president for the presence of that disorder. And this leads us all into 2020, where there are some of the largest mass protests the United States had seen since the 1960s, where an estimated 15 million Americans participated in these protests. Now, there are some voices in political commentary who will say that it is the legacy of these protests that helped return Trump back to office in 2024, which is a nonsense claim. And part of why it's a nonsense claim is because it's actually been well established that the 2020 protests contributed to Trump's defeat. that in the absence of those protests, he might have actually won. But the extent to which he was associated with disorder nationwide, the extent to which the protests made certain issues like racism and racial inequality and racial justice highly salient in ways that benefited the opposition to Trump, all of those contributed to him losing. The protests in a lot of ways were another test of the president's ability to handle a crisis along with COVID, and he just couldn't handle it, and it harmed his standing. The idea that the protests were beneficial to Trump, which was something that took hold quite quickly after the election in which he lost, very strange to me that you would have that take, but the idea that they helped him just isn't borne out. And the idea that they would help him 4 or 5 years after the fact doesn't make any sense either, especially when they weren't very salient in the 2024 election. What was salient was immigration and inflation. I should flip those because inflation was much more important to people's assessment of the candidates and their political choices than virtually every other issue. Now we're here in 2025, and there's another set of protests instigated by the administration. Now, just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to happen in the present or the future. Nothing, especially politics, moves along some linear line. But if we're going to be making guesses, if we're going to be making assessments of how these protests are going to affect Trump's standing, the evidence that we have is that protests are bad for Trump. That when the American public is on the streets screaming about something, screaming about the administration's policies, it's not good for him. We also have to consider that Trump entered office relatively unpopular, although more popular than he had been in the past, and his popularity has been on a steady decline since then. Recent polls have him around -9, -10 net approval. His approval has dropped basically across every single demographic category. And the most recent polling we have on calling out the military to meet protesters in Los Angeles show that most voters don't like this. They disapprove of this action. They don't want to see it happen. So here we have an unpopular president, and I shouldn't forget his big, beautiful bill, his fiscal package, which is brutally unpopular with most Americans who correctly see it as a giveaway to the top 0.1% of income earners. So we have an unpopular president with an unpopular agenda, doing unpopular things, facing protest in much the same manner that harmed him during his first term. Do we think this is going to be beneficial for him, or do we think that it's going to harm him? In my view, my argument is that it's going to harm him, that these protests are going to further weaken the administration, and that even calling out the National Guard, calling out the Marines, escalating this quickly in the face of what is honestly a pretty modest protest is a sign of weakness. It is a reaction of people who know they're fighting something of a losing battle, that they know that the public isn't necessarily on their side. And what they want to do is create some sort of situation, some sort of scenario. They want to instigate something to win the public back to them, or at least win some of the public's sympathy. But I don't think that's going to happen, for the simple reason that most Americans are actually pretty fair-minded. And most Americans don't like the idea of yanking 4-year-olds from their doctors, from their life-saving treatment, and shipping them out of the country. Most Americans don't like the idea of their neighbors, of their friends, of their partners, people at their churches, people who work with them, who run businesses that they frequent. They don't like the idea of those people being snatched away by state-sanctioned kidnappers and sent away for basically what is an administrative error, for what is something that isn't meaningfully a crime. They don't like the idea, in short, of the state being extremely unfair with people who have done really nothing other than try to better their lives. Now, there's a lot to say about how the public couldn't internalize this, couldn't come to this perspective during the election. I think it has a lot to do with the nation's broken information environment, with the fact that there's no one really challenging the assertions being made about the number of undocumented immigrants and the nature of their presence here. And I think it has something to do with the lack of any meaningful political opposition to immigration restrictionism. That the Democratic Party, far from trying to stand up for a more open vision of American society, essentially capitulated in the idea that it is of vital national importance that we begin rounding up people here for work and shipping them out.
That bipartisan bill would hire 1,500 more security agents and officers, 100 more immigration judges to help tackle the backload of 2 million cases, 4,300 more asylum officers, and new policies so they can resolve cases in 6 months instead of 6 years now. What are you against?
So a lot of blame to go around. But we're here. Now is now. The past is the past. And in the present, the American public, although it likes the idea of deportations, does not like how it looks in practice, does not like the implementation, does not like the egregious cruelty of the Trump administration. Los Angeles is just going to be one example of that. There will be more. And I'm not really in the business of offering direct political advice, but should you be a Democrat watching this, I would say that this is an opportunity to get ahead of it, to begin articulating a positive vision for immigration in this country and vocally standing up against the administration, vocally calling out the administration's illegal actions, vocally opposing the administration and its efforts to use immigration enforcement as an excuse to do an authoritarian crackdown on the entire country. And if you're simply someone concerned about all of this, someone just trying to be a good citizen, I would say that in addition to contacting your representatives and telling them to stand up against this anti-immigration effort, I would say that maybe you'll be needed on the streets. Maybe you'll be needed as part of the group of Americans protecting their neighbors from ICE and telling the public, telling the administration, telling people in my business that they don't like what they're seeing and that it ought to stop. American democracy is not perfect. It's obviously endangered right now. But one thing that does work, one thing that does have an impact, is all of us standing up, going on the streets, and just saying no.